When you left, lost a part of me. A Smilin' Friends fanfiction readin'. Written by Precious Piece of Cheese. And narrated by Precious Piece of Cheese. This fic was originally written for audiences 18 years of age or older. If you are under the age of 18, please do not continue listening to this video. Content warnings. This fic focuses on themes of death, grief, mourning, suicidal thoughts, mental health issues, and self-harm. If you do not wish to hear about any of these topics, please do not continue listening to this video. Also to mention that this is a Char-Pim focused story, so if you are not interested in that ship, please click off of this video. This narration of the story has been changed to better suit the podfic medium. This fic is originally written as a songfic to the song We Belong Together by Mariah Carey. Due to technological limitations and copyright claim concerns, the song will be omitted from this telling of the story. But there is a link in the description box of the original fanfiction if you would like to read it in its original form. A thick, agonizing cloak of grief suffocated Pim's consciousness as he screamed out into the void of the desolate winter forest. Alan and Glep flinched at the sound, never having heard such a vocalization of pain and regret be emitted from another living being. Pim, still wailing like a mother who had witnessed the murder of her children before her very eyes, fell to his knees within the deep, unforgiven snow, which was now stained with the blood and organs of his dearly departed. He screeched out Charlie's name as if God could hear him from above and grant him the mercy of bringing back his beloved. In Pim's heart, he knew that he was unworthy of such mercy, for he was the murderer. If he had not quarreled with Charlie over such trivial things, Charlie would have never wielded the axe to chop down the tree of his demise. This all could have been prevented. Yet there Pim was, screaming the life out of his lungs in the purest form of regret. He took it back. He took every single word he had uttered back, even if doing so wouldn't bring his beloved back to earth. Seconds dragged into eternities for Pim as he screamed till his lungs physically failed him, resulting in a hoarse cry resembling a dying animal on their last breaths. His eyes were so full of frozen tears that they couldn't even conceptualize it when the ambulance arrived to collect what was left of Charlie from under that cursed tree and drive away with him. Charlie was gone. Even within the amalgamation of shredded skin, scattered organs, and gallons of blood that littered the snow, Charlie was still there. But now, his image was only to be secluded to Pim's memories and his mind's eye. Alan and Glep looked at each other, wondering if they would ever be able to get Pim to leave the tragic scene behind. They knew that leaving their grieving and mentally fragmented coworker in the freezing woods wasn't morally sound, yet no amount of convincing could get him to rise from the snow. Alan made the final decision to simply pick Pim up and carry him to the company car to bring him home, no matter how much he kicked and screamed. Pim claimed in desperate delusion that he needed to stay and wait for Charlie to come back. He simply couldn't accept that his world was gone. Alan, Glep, and Pim drove back to civilization in deafening silence. Pim had given up the fruitless endeavor of screaming, and all he could do was exist in the cold silence. He sat alone in the back seat and stared blankly at the darkening winter sky, with only one thought in his mind: that he was a foolish menace. The final words that he had exchanged with Charlie replayed in his mind like a broken tape. He mulled over each syllable, which pierced his heart deeper with each remembrance. It all seemed so superficial now, and even though he could regret every breath he took, the words could never truly be undone. Charlie was still dead at the end of the day, and he died assuming that his best friend thought he was a horrible person. Charlie died knowing a lie. Pym never truly felt the words that he spoke. He simply spoke in blind, frivolous frustration. This was a pure nightmare. Part of Pym wondered if he was conscious at all, and that he'll wake up in his bed with a fresh wave of relief drenching over him upon realizing that none of this was real. This couldn't be real, right? It was simply too unnatural for Charlie to die so young under such egregious circumstances. Charlie was only 27 years old. He had so much life left to live, yet Pym ripped it away from him like a merciless grim reaper. Pym and Charlie were supposed to have so many more adventures together, smiles shared, and years of friendship under their belts. There was still so much more that Pym wanted to confess to him, and so much more love to share. They were supposed to be together forever. Pym wasn't meant to be left alone in this calloused world without the one person that he felt like grounded him to it. Pym wasn't meant to be without Charlie. No one would care for Pym like Charlie did, but in his final moments, it seemed that Charlie didn't care for him at all. Pym pinched his arm so hard that he drew blood to wake himself out of the nightmare, yet there he sat in the back of the company car on a Christmas Eve night with his dearly beloved's blood stained on his sweater. Alan specifically felt great internal resistance to leave Pym alone in his apartment in his current state of mind, but what could he do? He knew that nothing he could do would help him feel any better. It wasn't like he could bring Charlie back to life. Alan wished Pym well, and to call him if he needed anything. He then let him out in front of his apartment complex without Pym having said a word in return. There was nothing Pym could say anymore. Like a body without a soul, Pym walked back into his apartment and crawled into bed, barely processing that he was moving at all. The only thing he was acutely aware of was the all-encompassing loneliness that he felt both within his room and in the universe at large. He was alone. Completely alone. No matter how many other people he could surround himself with, he'd still feel the pulsating Charlie-shaped scar in his heart that time could never heal. No one else in the universe could come close to wielding the magnitude of love that Pym felt for that man. It felt so surreal, so unnatural, so needlessly cruel. Yet there was Pym, alone in the world, without the one person that made it seem all worthwhile. Who was he to feel sorry for himself when this was all his fault? There was no room for self-pity when he was the one who pulled the trigger. He might as well have wielded that axe himself and purposefully pushed the tree in Charlie's direction. It was simply the consequences of his actions. He should know this. He knew it was his fault, yet he couldn't help but hold on to that victim mentality that shielded his wounded mind from the full breadth of what he had done. He deserved to feel this pain. He deserved to fully embrace it as to remind himself of exactly what he did and who exactly he lost. He would refuse to forget it as long as he lived. A flare of intense anger surged through him, and he hit his arm repeatedly, as if he was possessed to do so. He needed to feel this pain to honor Charlie's death, he thought to himself. He needed to suffer. He needed to continually remind himself that he was a selfish, ignorant murderer who killed his soulmate because he assumed everything was wrong with his character. He assumed he knew Charlie so well at that moment that those venomous words were gospel, but how wrong he was. How could he ever think such cruel things about the man he loved? The crushing grief soon replaced the anger in his mind. He could be angry at himself and at the world as much as he wanted, but nothing could eclipse the great sadness that stained his heart. He shoved his face into his pillow and cried heavy tears of monumental loss. Charlie was gone. That sentence lifted so many emotions, but pure sadness was what felt the heaviest on his heart. He loved Charlie. He had for many years, yet now Charlie will never know just how much he did. A fragment of his mind was still in denial, like Charlie would come back at some point, even though it was impossible. Pym would miss absolutely everything about him. His voice, his laugh, the days they spent together in and out of work, his sarcastic jokes, his calm presence, his natural scent, pretty much everything about him that Pym would never experience again. Pym dreaded the day when his memory would fail to recall exactly how Charlie sounded, or when Charlie's scent would permanently evaporate from the earth. Perhaps the aspect of the loss that was the hardest to digest, besides the regrets of his words, was that Charlie would never know, truly, how much Pym loved him. Yes, they were friends for 7 years, but oh, how Pym wished for more than that. As much as he loved Charlie as a friend, he also loved him romantically, but Charlie would never know that now. Pym wasn't sure if Charlie ever loved him that way, but it was the lost opportunities that killed him the most. What if Charlie did love him back, and when Pym confessed his love to him, they would become boyfriends, or maybe even husbands? Pym's deepest fantasy was to marry Charlie and have a peaceful, happy life together in some cute house in the suburbs with pets and adopted children. He wanted to wake up next to him every day and fall asleep with him every night and share peaceful, mundane moments with soft kisses and gentle words of endearment. He wanted someone to call his own, someone that loved him unconditionally, someone he could always rely on, and no one was better than Charlie to him. Now, it didn't matter what Pym wanted, since he destroyed his own happiness. He didn't deserve to have anything he wanted. Pym eventually got up and got ready for bed by taking a shower and putting on pajamas. As much as he wanted to pass out in his day clothes, having Charlie's blood splattered on his sweater was doing too much for him at the moment. He wasn't sure if having some of Charlie with him was comforting or traumatizing. Once he crawled under the covers, showered with clean clothes on, another wave of crippling grief washed over him. Pym almost always disliked sleeping alone at night since it reminded him of everything wrong in his life and how alone he felt, which was why those Saturday nights that Pym and Charlie always shared were so deeply comforting, since Charlie would always be there on the couch, sleeping. The closest Pym ever got to sleeping with him was if they both passed out on the couch, but Pym would be lying if he said that he didn't entertain the thought of sleeping with Charlie regularly. His gentle, protective energy was what Pym yearned for in a man, and his warm, soft body would be the perfect to hold onto at night. The dream of having the comfort and presence of the man he loved sleeping next to him was eradicated. Pym felt like a shell of a man at that point, completely devoid of any part of him that felt like himself. Without Charlie, what else was there to life? What joy was there to be found without his favorite person? Pym feared that he couldn't even pretend to be joyful anymore, and that was saying a lot, since he was the master at pretending. He had to do it for his job all of the time and to convince everyone else in his life that he was okay. Now, not a cell in his body had the will to do that anymore, or anything for that matter. When Charlie left the world, it was as if he took Pym's soul with him. They were so inseparable that Pym couldn't seem to function without him. Pym wasn't sure how to respond to being so reliant on another person, but people needed others to survive, he convinced himself. He simply didn't want to live without Charlie. Physically? Could he? Yes, of course he could. Mentally and emotionally, Pym considered himself dead by those standards. It would be surviving, not living to him. And what was life without living? If there was a world without Charlie, Pym simply didn't want to be a part of it. Pym couldn't have imagined that his life would end up this way, completely alone in the world with the blood of his soulmate on his hands. It would have hurt less if Pym was the one to die instead of Charlie. Charlie wasn't as dependent on Pym as Pym was to him, he thought. Charlie could live without him. Pym was his friend, but nothing more as far as he knew. Charlie could find a million friends and a million lovers if he wanted to because he was Charlie. Pym needed Charlie because no one else on this earth would love him the same. Not even his own family did. No one did. He barely even knew why Charlie liked him as much as he did. Maybe he never did at all, but Charlie could lie and say that he loved him, and Pym would still take it as gospel. Pym was so desperate for love that he'd live with the lie as long as the words were spoken. Now, the one person that could have loved him the most was gone, and he knew damn well that no one else in the world would love him as much as he did. Heavy, desperate tears fell once more, and he screamed out his name into the void of his desolate room repeatedly, not caring if he would disturb the neighbors at this ungodly hour of the night. Pym didn't care about anything anymore. For him, there was nothing left to lose since he lost everything. He screamed his desperate pleas, digging his fingers into the bedding and lifting his head up to the heavens. He screamed for him to come back, that he was sorry, that he loved him, everything Pym could possibly say to Charlie. He admitted in the most animalistic cry a critter could vocalize. He vaguely heard a stark strike from the floor beneath him from his downstairs neighbor, chastising him, but Pym still wailed. It was like he was back in the forest at the scene again, and he didn't stop until his voice gave out, reducing his pleas to weak, hoarse whispers that dissipated into the air. Pym laid flat on his back, on his bed, staring up at the ceiling with not an ounce of breath left in his lungs. Pym wondered if this was divine punishment from God because of something Pym did, even though he couldn't figure out what that could be. Maybe he was just cursed from birth, never having meant to have fulfillment and happiness. It was just too bad that the life of another critter had to get ensnared in his cursed existence. He knew it in his heart that he and Charlie spiritually belonged together, just maybe not in this timeline. Maybe they were lovers in another life. There was no one to rely on anymore. There was no comfort, no one to comfort him anymore. There will never be another Charlie. He needed to leave this life to be with him again. Maybe he could finally be at peace with Charlie in the afterlife. Pym smiled ever so faintly at the thought of it. With that idea serving as solace, Pym finally closed his eyes. The days that passed since that night seemed to not even exist to Pym. The office was closed for the holidays, which was a great relief for Pym since he couldn't fathom working right now. But it just meant that Pym rotted in his apartment all day instead. He was exhausted all the time, yet he couldn't sleep well at night. He was plagued by his rotation of thoughts that suffocated him, and he would regularly have emotional outbursts of screaming, crying, and even hurting himself. He got threatening notes from his landlord about noise complaints, but he didn't care. Even the things that once always brought him comfort and joy, like his favorite movies and music, became hollow. He now spent his days mindlessly scrolling online, listening to sad music, and writing his thoughts in circles in a journal. He was also physically neglectful, having not changed out of his pajamas in days, only getting a few hours of sleep at night, and barely eating. He ignored texts from Alan and Glep, and only responded with a one-word reply when Alan confirmed the date of Charlie's funeral. Pym was a dead man walking at that point. Pym knew that it was not going to get better. He couldn't imagine why it had any right to get better. The longer he was without Charlie, the worse off he was. He felt himself slip deeper and deeper into despair and hollowness as the minutes wasted away. Now, it wasn't only the loss of Charlie's presence that weighed heavy on his heart, but it was anything that even remotely reminded him of Charlie. Whether it was the one side of the couch that Charlie always sat in that was more sunken in than Pym's side, or a meme on his feed that he recalled Charlie showing him. It seemed like he couldn't see anything involving Charlie in a positive light anymore, for only pain and regret followed him. Charlie's memory pained him so much that he had to turn down all of the photos of him that he had in his room. He used to have a display of photos of them together from throughout the years, but now they lay abandoned in a dresser drawer to avoid more crying fits than necessary. Even his portrait of Charlie that he cherished, that lived on his bedside table, laid face down on the surface. He didn't quite have the heart to hide it away, but he couldn't live with having Charlie's eyes watch him anymore. Oh, how crippling it was to have what was once comforting to you be the only thing that pained you. As much as Pym wanted to block out all that was Charlie so he could forget his pain and live on, he was incapable of doing so. He loved and hated Charlie for being that essential to him. He was all that plagued his mind, all that haunted his dreams, and all that rested within his heart. Pym knew that the funeral was tomorrow, and it was going to be traumatic, but also a moment of closure. At least then he could see Charlie again, even if only through a closed casket. Alan requested the closed casket to conceal his mangled corpse, and Pym secretly thanked him for that. After that, though, what was Pym to do once Charlie was buried 6 feet under and gone for good? Pym, who was previously standing aimlessly in his living room, broke down and fell to his knees into another grief-stricken episode. The thought was simply too much to bear of saying goodbye to Charlie forever once the funeral was over. He also dreaded the thought of being seen in public again, which he hadn't done for nearly a week at this point. Even though it was acceptable to be mourning at a funeral, obviously, Pym still couldn't find the strength to be around others at the moment. He just couldn't let Alan, Glep, and Mr. Boss see him out of character, for they'd just worry about him and give him unwanted attention. Everyone knew how close he and Charlie were, so it was expected for Pym to hold his loss the heaviest. But Pym couldn't stand others watching him go through such a traumatic experience. As much as Pym wanted to not go and visit his grave alone later, he simply had to be present to honor Charlie's memory. It would be cruel to not show up to his funeral for his own selfish needs. Pym's anger returned, and he punched himself hard in the side of the head at his pondering of skipping the funeral. Why would he even conceptualize such a horrendous idea? As if he already wasn't such a monster for causing all of this to begin with. Not being there for Charlie in his final moments on Earth was unredeemable. He almost couldn't imagine how far he had fallen from grace, but part of him could believe that. For years, he had to put up a masquerade of being a joyful, kind critter despite the darkness and melancholy that bubbled beneath the surface. He did have genuine joy in his heart somewhere, even though it was thoroughly coated by depression, trauma, and insecurity. Despite all of that, the grief he felt now was so much more out of his element than any other way he had felt before. He couldn't even recognize the critter in the mirror anymore, with deep set eye bags, sunken in cheeks, dusky purple skin, and lifeless eyes. It was like he was already dead. Pym laid face down on the floor for an unknown period of time before finally rising to his feet again. He simply didn't want to live anymore. He couldn't take it. He couldn't take the pain anymore. He needed it all to end. He needed to escape. His hand shook violently at the adrenaline of that thought. Despite the many trials in his life, he had never once seriously contemplated taking his own life. Until now. How could he live with himself after all that he had done? He had not only harmed himself, but also the lives of all of those that cared for Charlie, too. He didn't deserve to live for that. He couldn't live with himself for that either. It wasn't like he was going to be missed that much, anyway. Sure, Ellen, Glep, and Mr. Boss would be sad at the loss of a coworker, but that's all he was to them. A coworker. He was replaceable. Mr. Boss would hire someone in his place who could do his job better, and then he'd be forgotten. If Charlie was still alive, he might care more if Pym died, but it wasn't like that was in the equation anymore. There was nothing left in Pym's world that he cared to lose. A haunting rush of relief flooded his soul once he thought about it a little bit more. He'd be free from all pain, guilt, and shame. He'd see Charlie in the afterlife and have a chance to apologize to him for all that he had done. Maybe Charlie would forgive him. He thought he might. He'd get to be with Charlie forever. Pym hitched a breath once that sentence hit his consciousness. He'd get to be with Charlie forever. He could tell Charlie everything he wished he told him in life. He could confess his love to him. Charlie could admit his love for Pym, too. They could be lovers in the afterlife. In the afterlife, everything was beautiful, and he and Charlie could have a peaceful, loving companionship forever. He stopped his train of thought for just a moment. He couldn't do it just now, for he still needed to attend the funeral. That would be the last thing he'd do, and then he'd end it all, and finally be at peace. He just needed to honor Charlie's mortal life once more before he departed to the afterlife. For the first time in a long time, Pym genuinely smiled. For the first time in a week, Pym slept soundly. Now that he had a plan, he felt at peace. He wasn't completely at peace, though, for he still had to attend the funeral that day, which was hopefully going to be the last emotionally challenging thing he'd ever have to do. Just one more mountain to climb, he thought. He got up and ironed his good suit and thoroughly cleaned himself up for the first time in a while. He still felt the distinct and now familiar hole in his soul from the part of him that Charlie took with him. Anxiety brewed in his chest as the minutes dwindled down to when Alan and Glep were going to pick him up. He felt his heart jump into his throat when he got the dreaded text of Alan declaring that he was there. The car ride to the cemetery was painful. The finality of it all hit him like a ton of bricks. So, this was it, huh? This was the last time he would see Alan, Glep, and Mr. Boss. This was the last time he'd see Charlie's physical body. This was the last time he'd ride in a car, feel the wind on his skin, stand in the snow, and be in the company of others. Pym didn't really want to die. He just wanted the pain to stop. He just felt like death was his only escape from all that haunted him. Tears pricked in his eyes. He'd missed the times when life felt good, like making clients smile, laughing with others, feeling the summer air on his skin, smelling fresh-cut flowers, the sound of every song that he ever loved, and every beautiful morning and peaceful night. Unfortunately, the pain was simply too monolithic to carry on with. He just hoped that heaven was just like it was always portrayed to be. Pym knew that Charlie magically coming back to life was hopeless, but in a last-ditch effort, he prayed. Pym wasn't a religious critter, but he was so desperate that he figured throwing a prayer into the universe was worth trying in case God was listening. He shut his eyes, clasped his hands together, and muttered his prayer under his breath. Oh, dear Lord, please, if you would lend a gentle ear of mercy, I beg of you to bring Charlie Dompler back to this earth. His earthly presence would be for the deep comfort and peace of all those alive who have loved him dearly. Please, Lord, give Charlie Dompler the blessing of continuing a healthy and fulfilling life of love and happiness. Amen. Despite being surrounded by everyone that Charlie had known during his lifetime at the funeral service, Pym had never felt more alone, even more so than those days wasting away in his room. He felt the demanded yet sympathetic gazes of the others burn him with a knowing energy. Everyone knew who Charlie was to Pym. Pym felt the strange yet unknown pressure of being expected to be a certain way right now, like a specific performativity of grief was what would make everyone believe how sad he was. He just stood there with a twisted face of pain, fighting back tears. He was so very alone at one of the hardest moments in his life, saying goodbye to his soulmate for the last time. Pym lifted his head up and looked over to Alan, who stood next to Gleb on the opposite side of the casket from Pym. He had barely said a word to him, but they both spent a few seconds giving eye contact. The energy, Alan admitted, wasn't the hollow sympathy that he felt from the others. It was honest empathy. Pym knew that Al and Charlie were usually not on the best terms, but despite all of that, Alan knew what Charlie was to Pym. He knew it enough to keep the casket closed so Pym wouldn't need to be reminded of his disfigured corpse. Alan simply bowed his head a bit, and Pym mirrored the action. Even though Pym and Alan were never very close, Pym was still gonna miss him. Pym didn't register anything the priest said during the service. He kept his eyes fixed on the closed casket, still not quite believing that Charlie was inside. That was his Charlie lying in that casket, mangled beyond a recognizable state. Pym wondered if the morgue tried to reassemble his body. Probably not, since his body was so shredded from the tree. Charlie deserved a pristine corpse dressed in a nice suit, holding flowers against his chest while he rested for eternity. But Pym ripped that away too. Charlie deserved to pass at an old age peacefully in his sleep, yet that wasn't what happened. He died brutally, painfully, and unexpectedly. Pym's tears fell freely, yet silently, the weight of all that he had done coming down upon his shoulders as he stared back at the consequences of his actions. He was going to hell for this. Pym looked up at the gray winter sky and saw a pocket of beaming sunshine piercing through the thick overcast. Maybe that was Charlie looking down at them. The sun radiated some warmth on top of Pym's head, and tears fell down his face. It felt like a kiss from Charlie. Maybe Charlie did forgive him in the afterlife. He'd just have to find out once he got there. Mr. Boss gave a short speech, and then the priest closed out the funeral. Now, it was time to lower the casket. Pym's heart turned to stone. This was it. Pym closed his eyes. He couldn't bear to witness it. Charlie was going to be gone forever. In the blink of an eye, a sudden burst of light blinded the entire funeral party. Pym's entire field of vision turned stark white for a fraction of a second. Once the light cleared, everyone and everything was littered with bright yellow goo that seemed to come out of nowhere. Suddenly, the goo lifted and reassembled into a form in midair. It was Charlie. Pym thought he was hallucinating, but judging by the shocked faces of everyone else present, this was very much real. Charlie, who was stark naked, levitated in the air momentarily before descending to the ground. Charlie was alive. Pym, in a state of blind euphoria, ran over to Charlie and hugged him as tightly as he could. He didn't care if Charlie was butt naked in front of everyone he knew. He just needed to touch him and make sure he was real. Upon feeling the warmth of his body on his skin, Pym sobbed hysterically. Charlie, shell-shocked by everything that had occurred, froze in place for a few seconds, but then leaned down to hug Pym back. He gently rubbed Pym's back and whispered reassurance in his ear to calm him down. Charlie was alive. Pym's life was saved. Everything was right in the world again. If you had made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for listening through the entire story. And this one was an interesting one to both write initially and to record for this video because, as I've said in the intro, this was originally written as a songfic to We Belong Together by Mariah Carey because I love Mariah and that's one of my favorite songs by her. And also, more seriously, is that this I kind of twisted the interpretation on the song as like a breakup song to kind of like put it in the perspective of mourning somebody you lost. And since I do ship Char Pym, like if you have read my work on AO3, you know that because I do write Char Pym a lot, and kind of taken the Charlie's death from when Charlie dies and doesn't come back, put in all those pieces together, I just was really inspired to like create this story that is so focused onto Pym's perspective and how he is having his challenges through grief and a lot of mental health problems and like self-hatred and stuff like that. I just wanted to like create like an honest perspective and story about somebody that would be going through something similar to that. I personally love this story. Like this is one of my favorite things that I've written, and it was very much like a passion project pretty much because I was writing this in the middle of writing something else. That's like, I don't care if I don't really have time to do this. I just want to do it because this is what I'm inspired to do. Because as soon as I like made that connection between the episode and the song, and I'm like, I have to write this right now, and I did it fairly quickly. So yeah, I love this story, and I hope you all loved to listen to it. And there will be a link to the original story in the description box so you can kind of see my original vision for it. So, thank you, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!